question is, what besides, what inspires me really kind of to write what I write, and maybe where I write what I write, and has there ever been maybe even the wrinkle of an idea for setting something over in this neck of the woods? Okay, I'll tell you this. Before I made the final decision to set the Cork O'Connor novels up north, I considered northern Minnesota, or northern Wisconsin, because they're very similar. And at that point in time, I had spent just as much time in the northern part of your state as I had in northern Minnesota. And the reason I set my stuff up north, whether it was going to be here or over there, I think it's obvious. It's stunningly beautiful. I told you I'm not from Minnesota. One of the first decisions and best decisions my wife and I ever made was to begin vacationing up north. We began taking a part of every summer and spending it at a YMCA camp north of Ely, Minnesota. It's called Camp de Nord, which is literally across the road from the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. And when I discovered that remarkable, absolutely remarkable territory, I thought, people should be writing stories about it. And the reason is this. When you're a writer of fiction, what you're looking for is conflict. Because it's conflict that drives great stories. Think about the Romeo and Juliet. It's the Montagues against the Capulets. Conflict. Moby Dick, Ahab, and the White Whale. To Kill a Mockingbird. Social justice versus racial prejudice in the South during the Depression. Conflict, conflict, that's what drives great stories. When I looked up north, that's what I saw, was conflict. The Ojibwe and the white trying to live together, but not generally doing a very good job of it, or often not doing a good job of it. Conflict. Conflict in the nature of the land itself, particularly in the Arrowhead, that rugged, if you know the Arrowhead of Minnesota, that rugged, isolated, wonderful country. Conflict in the weather. Do we need to say more about that? Conflict, conflict, conflict. And so the North Country just, it was a place I knew great stories could come from. So that's really why I write out of this sense of place. Before anything else is sense of place. When I teach, I often teach writing. And when I teach character, I teach that after I teach setting. Because I think we're all molded significantly by that place out of which we rise. What surrounds us. And so, for me, at the bottom of everything is the place I write about. Yeah?
You use the Ojibwa so much and have such rich characters from that culture. Do you have a consultant that worked with you, or have you just researched it that much?
A consultant? She asked. This was the question, and I love this. I use so much of the Ojibwe culture in my work. Do I have a consultant? The next time I talk to my Ojibwe friends, I'm going to tell them, I'm going to call you my consultants from now on. They'll get a kick out of it.
You'll have to pay them.
I have, when I first began to write Iron Lake, I didn't know any Ojibwe. I didn't know anything about the Ojibwe, but I was a cultural anthropology major in college, and so the idea of learning about the Ojibwe culture excited me a great deal. And in the beginning, I did what every good academic does. I sat down and I began to read. I read all the early ethnographies that I could get my hands on. William Warren, Francis Densmore did a great job with that. I read books about Ojibwe myth. Gerald Visner does a great job with that, and ritual, Basil Johnson. Chenab storytellers, Jim Northrup, if you know his work, is a wonderful Chenab storyteller. So I read everything that I could get my hands on, and then I sat down and I began to write Iron Lake. When I was finished, I gave it to the Ojibwe, a couple of the Ojibwe people that I knew at that point. A woman who was a member of the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, and who was in fact an editor, and a guy who taught the Ojibwe language at the University of Minnesota, a guy named Alex Grubezki. And asked them to read it, tell me what I did wrong. They came back and they said, here an Indian wouldn't do that, and here an Indian wouldn't do that. But generally speaking, they thought I'd captured the sensibility of the Ojibwe pretty well. Alex took that manuscript with him as he went to visit a number of reservations all the way up into Canada that summer, and he came back and he said, I read bits and pieces of it to all the people I visited, and they liked it. They liked it very much. Great, great, great. I saw Alex about 6 months later, and we happened to bump into each other in downtown Minneapolis. He came running up to me and said, Kent, I got to tell you something. But before I tell you what Alex told me, I'll tell you this. In the Ojibwe culture, when one a member of that culture is speaking about another, they will often refer to each other as shinobs, short for Anishinaabe, shinobs. So he came up to me and said, Kent, you know, I just went and visited all those people who I had read parts of your manuscript to, and everywhere I went, they were asking me, so, how's that Shinob storyteller doing? They thought I was Ojibwe, which pleased me no end. So, yeah. What else? Yeah.
I'm going to make a big assumption, and then I'm going to ask my question.
Okay.
So I made the assumption. Now the question is, tell us a time when you were writing and you thought you had written yourself into a corner and your characters came to your rescue.
Do you know, that almost never happens for this reason. There's only been one time when that happened, and I'll explain that one. But it almost never happens for this reason. I think my stories through before I ever begin to write them. So an idea will come to me, and it can come to me in a variety of ways as just an image. More often than not, it's just kind of an image that comes to me. And I let it sit in my mind when I'm finishing my current project, and sometimes that's weeks, and sometimes that's months. And while that seed of an idea is there, it rolls around, and events begin to suggest themselves, and characters, and chronology, and motivations. And by the end of those weeks, or more often months, I have the story. I know how it begins, I know how it ends, I know who did what to whom and why, all of those things. And then, in the old days, I used to actually sit down and I would outline it chapter by chapter. So I knew what each chapter would accomplish in moving the story forward. I don't do that anymore. But I still need to know as much as I can about the story before I begin. I was tripped up only once in that regard, and it was with one of my favorite books, a book called Blood Hollow. Blood Hollow, for those of you who haven't read it, is about an Ojibwe, a young Ojibwe man who is accused of murdering a white girl. And Cork O'Connor believes he didn't do it and sets about trying to prove it. The young man's name is Solemn Wintermoon. In my early thinking of the book, and as I actually plotted it out and had outlined it, was going to be sort of a Perry Mason-esque kind of a thing. Cork is married to an attorney, and I had this thing where Joe, his wife, would prove Solemn's innocence in a great courtroom scene and all of that bunk. In the middle of the writing of this book, I learned that my mother was dying. And suddenly all of the questions I was asking myself about life in general changed. And it changed this book. Suddenly I realized that wasn't the book I wanted to write. And what was I supposed to write instead? And I ended up writing a book, the first book where very clearly the subtext is the spiritual journey. And that's why this is one of my favorite books. Whenever I look at this book, I think of my mother.